All right, welcome back everyone to In the Day. We have an exciting panel planned, Innovative Synthesis Strategies. Our first panel presentation will be given by Dr. Howard White. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the Campbell Collaboration, and he was previously the founding Executive Director of the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, 3IE, and he has led the Impact Evaluation Program of the World Bank's Independent Evaluation Group. He started his career as an academic researcher at the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague and the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. As an academic, he leans towards work with policy relevance and work in the policy field and believes in academic rigor as a basis for policy and practice. His other interests are running and walking, preferably long distances in remote places, and reading English history. His presentation is Innovative Approaches to Knowledge Translation, Evidence Platforms, and Evidence Portals. If you have any questions during this panel, please ask them in the chat box and we'll address these following the last presentation of this panel. And as a reminder, the pull-down menu has an option for all panelists and attendees. Please select that one so we can all participate in the discussion. Howard, are you ready to begin?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Here we go. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about different approaches to knowledge translation with a particular focus on evidence platforms and evidence portals. But by way of background, I would like to talk first about what I call the evidence revolution. So over the last 30 years now, there's been an evidence revolution or an evolution of the evidence architecture over 4 waves, starting with the results agenda in the 1990s. But I'm going to focus more particularly in this presentation on the second, third, and fourth waves of the rise of impact evaluations, particularly randomized controlled trials, the rise of systematic reviews, and in particular focus on knowledge brokering. So here we have what I call the knowledge brokering or knowledge translation pyramid, which gives an overview of the evidence architecture. And we're going to come back to this slide later, so don't worry, don't take it in all now. But the basic idea that's conveyed in this slide is as you move up the pyramid, then there's a heavier degree of knowledge translation. So we have at the bottom of the pyramid our data, and many people conflate data with evidence these days, but data are not evidence. Data, so people will say things like, we've got the data, now we're going to see what works. Well, you're not just from having the data. You need to go ahead and analyze those data in primary studies, and those studies get summarized, systematic reviews, and so on. We'll come back to that as we go through different stages of this pyramid now. So here we are at the bottom of the slide, which are data. And data isn't just about having data being available, it's about the infrastructure that helps data be better and more useful. So in particular, in the field of disability research, is actually simply having a measure of disability prevalence and different types of disability and understanding where disability, where it's most common and what's associated with disability and the problems associated with people with disabilities. So there are a couple of well-known questionnaire approaches to measuring disability. Probably the best known is WHO Model Disability Survey. The long version of that can take a couple of hours, and it doesn't have actually a clear cutoff defining disability, person being with disability or not. It's more of a spectrum. So some researchers in the field, I'm not one, but I work with them and have asked their opinion on this, find that actually maybe it's not that useful. More preferred is the disability group, the Washington group on disability statistics, particularly their set of short questions, which ask a number of questions around particular areas such as sight and hearing, whether people are impaired or seriously impaired in those areas. But it focuses particularly on severe disabilities. And so again, there's some feeling there's still some room for improvement. But the important point is that if we're going to have good data, we want to have a common understanding what we mean by disability, and so having a clear understanding that's usable in different contexts and validated across different contexts is a good starting point. So data important doesn't mean having numbers, but means having numbers that are comparable and understood both at national and international levels. Then, of course, the data we use to undertake studies. And what we've seen over the last 15 to 20 years of the second wave of the evidence revolution is a growth in impact evaluations. So impact evaluations, I think all the people on this webinar will know, are a particular type of evaluation that want to tell you whether the intervention you're looking at made a difference or not. So if you're undertaking singing classes for elderly people to improve the social life of people who, including those at risk or having early onset dementia, having different stages of dementia, then, well, is that program actually achieving that? You can't just look at what happens to those people. You have to see what happened to those people with the intervention compared to what will happen in the absence of the intervention. And we do that generally. There are a variety of statistical approaches to doing it, but we do it most commonly by using a randomized controlled trial in which some people are randomly assigned into having the treatment and others are assigned into usual services or an alternative treatment. And as you see in the left-hand panel in the graph, randomized controlled trials in the area of disability research have grown quite rapidly over the last 15 years. This is a snapshot from PubMed, and you see there around 900, close to 1,000 studies, with a steady growth over recent years. The drop-off in 2019 is just because 2019 hasn't finished yet, and those studies published in 2019 might have made it into PubMed. And so you would expect to see, when we do this graph a year from now, continued rise in 2019 as well. So this is good news. There's an increasing amount of evidence about what works, the key expression here, an increasing amount of evidence about what works in the fields of improving quality of life for people with disabilities. When we have a growing body of research like this, it's very important not to base what we want to do in a particular context. We want to develop a policy to think about what program is most effective. We want to start a new program in a new area, a new population. So let's look at what seems to work elsewhere. We shouldn't base that on single studies. There's often too much hype around a single study. There's actually a literature showing that the first study of intervention tends to find larger effects from later studies. One reason being that attempts to take programs to scale are often ineffective, so programs may work on a pilot stage, on a small scale, but for a variety of reasons don't work when you take to a larger scale, or they might work in one population, one context, but not work in another population or another context. And so it's important to look across the whole body of evidence, and we do that using systematic reviews. So, and the third wave of the evidence revolution has been the rise of systematic reviews, in particular over the last 10 years or so. In health-related fields, which includes much of disability research, they have been going on for longer, but in most fields, and you see the same is true in the right-hand panel on this slide, there's been a growth in systematic reviews, particularly in the last 10 years or so. So systematic reviews are an approach to systematically surveying all available evidence, doing a very thorough search. So a typical systematic review will find several thousand, so 10,000, 15, 20,000 studies in its search, which are then systematically screened against very clear explicit inclusion and exclusion criteria to see which studies are eligible to be included for the particular question you're trying to answer with that review. And all the included studies are systematically coded and then systematically synthesized, and the findings systematically reported. Systematic is the key thing there. And being systematic in this way seeks to avoid the biases that are present in traditional literature reviews. So it's not sufficiently widely known. There's a whole host of biases that affect both primary studies, but also affect reviews. And so when someone tells me, oh, I'm going to commission this or that expert to review literature on this particular field, because she's the expert in the area, so if we ask her to review the field, we'll get a good summary of what the field says. I always say, just save your money, just ask her what she thinks already, because that's what the review will say. Literature reviews have biases, and any person doing literature review, even unconsciously or subconsciously, will select evidence in a way that supports what they already believe, support their priors, and find ways to ignore marginalised evidence doesn't agree with what they think. Systematic reviews can't do this. Systematic reviews have to include all available evidence relevant to your review. You can't exclude it if you don't like the findings, don't like the person or whatever. And so give a much more reliable overview of what the evidence says. So the rise of systematic reviews, which is which underpins the evidence movements. Evidence-based health was built on systematic reviews, is a great boon to the what works and having knowledge about what works across a whole range of policy areas, including, of course, intervention for people with disabilities. So moving up the evidence pyramid, what I'm doing, I've skipped over databases. Databases, very briefly, can be specified for a particular type of literature. So Epistimonikos is a health database, which is restricted to effectiveness studies, randomized controlled trials and other designs that say whether programs are effective or not, and systematic reviews of effectiveness studies. And it has some very nice functionality for mapping and so on as well. So if you're not familiar with Epistimonikos, the name is there on the slide. I suggest you go and have a look at it. Not now, please, but after the end of the webinar tonight, please go and take a look at Epistimonikos. You'll find it, I think, quite a useful resource. And there are other databases in different domains, and I'll come back to some resource of disability in a little while. So moving up, though, to evidence maps. Evidence maps are a way of taking the data from a particular domain and showing it visually in a way that allows for users to navigate the evidence in a way that should be useful to help uncover studies and learn something more about the landscape of the literature. So what we're seeing on the screen on this slide is an evidence and gap map produced by the Campbell Collaboration, funded by DFID, the UK Department of International Development, under a programme called SEDAL, of interventions for people with disabilities in low and middle income countries. And when you do a map like this, it's not so easy to read, but the rows are ordered by intervention categories and subcategories. So we have health as a category there, and that's broken down into promotion, prevention, rehabilitation, and so on. And then we have the outcomes ordered across different domains. There we have health again, education. So actually the community-based rehabilitation matrix WHO was used for the intervention and outcome categories in this particular map. And so they appear both in the intervention categories and the outcome categories. And then you have different subcategories. And in any one cell of the map, you get an idea of what research exists in that particular cell. So here we see highlighted is the cell that shows primary and secondary education and its impact on social and life skills development for people with disabilities. So this map is focused on studies looking at people with disabilities, both physical and mental. About half of the map is mental health. About half the studies in the map are mental health. And we include in the map both primary studies and systematic reviews. And so each little bubble in the map represents the a set of studies, and the larger the bubble, the more studies they are. And we've done what we call critical appraisal of the studies. Critical appraisal means you assess the risk of bias for various reasons, which might be high attrition in a primary study, might be not fully following full systematic procedures in a review. And so the largest orange bubble there, which we see as 8, is primary studies. So a number of low quality primary studies are 8, and then one medium high quality primary study for this particular cell. There are several factors driving low quality in disability literature. One is very small sample size. Many of the studies haven't done power calculations to determine what the sample size should be, but they seem to be very seriously underpowered. And the second is absence of a credible comparison group to actually see the intervention really measuring the effect of intervention. Then we have a couple of smaller bubbles for systematic reviews. In the map overall, it was on the last slide, there are just under 100, I think it's 102 primary studies and 56 systematic reviews in this map. So quite a lot of reviews compared to the overall literature. Then if you're using the map, you can click on any cell. And when you click on the cell, what you get on the left-hand panel is a list of the studies that are in that cell on the map. You can also click on a column heading or row heading and get a list of all the studies in that column or row. So here's the top study, top in terms of just coming top of the list, not in terms of anything else. It's actually alphabetical by study title, but you can reorder it in different ways. And so here's a study on academic achievement for people with hard of hearing in Ethiopia. And if you scroll down to the bottom of the abstract, you'll see that you've got a link to the URL for the study itself. And so the maps don't just allow you to navigate the data, they actually allow you to allow you to navigate the literature, to see what studies are there in this particular area. They also allow you to access all the studies of a database. It might take you to a publishing page for the journal where you just get the abstract of the article, and it might be behind a paywall. We can't do anything about that. But it does lead you to that page, and where the article's open access, we've got an open access copy we found, then we put that into the map as we actually access the article itself. So maps provide a way of both navigating with literature, but also actually of accessing literature as well. And maps have proved hugely popular in recent years, and the key takeaway from this map on individual people with disabilities in low middle income countries is basically the literature is pretty thin. I mean, we found more studies than expected, 100, but that's including mental health. They're very unevenly distributed geographically. So most of the studies come from 3 countries, China, India, and Turkey, and then quite a few also from Iran. There are very few indeed from countries in Africa, and the ones that are most of Uganda, so much of Africa is not represented. We did only search on the English language, so there might well be a Latin American literature that we're missing out, but there's not that much in other countries in South Asia, and some in Pakistan, but many other countries have very little literature indeed. And then we also see very uneven coverage across both intervention types and domains. So most in the health intervention areas, much less around livelihoods, very little around disability rights, hardly any studies there. So the map we saw was a Campbell map. It's not only Campbell producing maps. 3i, my previous organisation, does also do maps, but hasn't done any in the area of disability. This is a map produced by UK-based non-profit Sightsavers. Sightsavers have done several maps related to different sight-related issues. This is the cataract map. So the map here is different to the Campbell map. In this map, every bubble is a study. So in the Campbell map, each bubble represents a set of studies, high or low quality, and reviews or primary studies, and the size of the bubble represents the number of studies. In this case, every single bubble every circle is a study, and the color of the circle, as in the Campbell map, represents the quality of the study, the confidence you can have in study findings because of the risk of bias in that study. And they also, which we don't do, is represent what the studies actually find. So the strength of evidence, as you see in the far left column, is either strongly in favor of the intervention, inconclusive of the intervention, or have weak evidence in favor of the intervention. So we take, for example, the QCC column, which is quality of clinical care, which is the most heavily populated column. You'll see the reviews actually are spread mostly in the strong evidence in favor, but they're mostly low quality reviews, low confidence study findings. If we go down to weak, there are fewer reviews, but they're better quality. So, I mean, the problem with this approach is I can't actually tell you what the evidence says overall because it looks pretty mixed, and I don't believe in mixed evidence. I believe in synthesized evidence. So I see a picture like that, I want to say, well, we need to do a proper review. We do a review of reviews, or we can actually just do a review across this whole area. So I'm more in favor of maps that tell you what the evidence is out there. I'm less inclined to use a map to say, well, what the evidence says, because for that you need to do a new review. So now we move in the next stage up the evidence knowledge translation pyramid and move to knowledge evidence platforms. So evidence platforms are basically online resources that allow you to access a range of evidence-based evidence resources. So KDDRR has a knowledge translation library. You see it here on the slide, and this gives access to various resources about knowledge translation. So this is the knowledge translation library on this page, and if you look on the left, you'll see a list of sub-menu items to help you navigate this particular platform. Here's another example. This is the GLAD network, Global Action on Disability. So again, they have an online evidence resource where you can access different types of documents like guidelines, but also policy documents, brochures, and so on. So it's a platform for accessing disability-related resources at a global level, so across the world. And this is the third evidence platform. This is the ILO Disability Evidence Platform. It's restricted to authorised users. I'm not one, so I can't tell you what's inside. I've never been inside, but I imagine it's really good. So if anyone doesn't know anything about it, feel free to tell us what's in there. So there's 3 examples of evidence platforms, not portals. I'll come on portals in a moment. And then there are other disability platforms like DRC, but this is not an evidence platform. This is a platform of general disability resources, which a couple of the previous ones leaned a bit that way, but it's not got any particularly strong evidence orientation. So it's resources like the health and anxiety apps, which may or may not work. We don't know what's the evidence. We don't know. It's not necessarily readily found on this platform. So the platforms make the evidence available, but we then have to go and look at the evidence and interpret it. Okay, so now going back to look at this evidence architecture pyramid. So we're moving now to top 3 levels. And the important thing about the top 3 levels is they allow the decision maker to make a decision based on the evidence without having to go back and consult the evidence. All the previous levels, evidence platforms, maps, databases, and so on, take you back to the studies. And a systematic review is a very nice thing. I love reviews, but a review can be 200, 300 pages long. So many practitioners don't have the time to read that or necessarily even to interpret how to use the findings. So these top 3 levels broker the evidence to a much greater degree. And evidence portals, as we'll see, say, here's the evidence, you decide what to do. Guidelines say, we've looked at the evidence, we recommend you do this. And checklists say, we've looked at the evidence, just do this. Don't think about it, just do this. So let's quickly look at 3 examples. So this is a teaching learning toolkit. It's not related to disability. It's run by the What Works Centre for Education here for England, the Education Endowment Foundation. And they've taken 34 different interventions, starting with arts participation, which they think will possibly improve learning outcomes. And through each of these 34 interventions, they've undertaken a systematic review of the global evidence. Then on the evidence portal landing page, which we see here, they present the evidence in 3 metrics. The first is cost, so high or low cost or simple 1 to 5. The second is strength of evidence, which is how good is the evidence. So 5 stars is high quality systematic review, one lock, so 5 locks is high quality systematic review, 1 lock is no randomized controlled trials, just Blair, just some process evaluations. Nothing to really judge effectiveness. And finally, the last column, impact, is about what's the impact of this intervention on a child's learning outcomes in terms of months of schooling. So having arts participation in your curriculum is equivalent to having an additional 2 months of schooling. So you'll see here, if you sort it, you'll see feedback is very effective. 8 months additional learning, very low cost. Repeating a year is actually very expensive and actually sets a child back by 4 months, so it's a very bad thing to do. So the evidence portal allows people to make decisions, and 2/3 of schools in England use this portal to make decisions how to allocate school resources. So the World Health Organization does international guidelines on various things, including age disability, and countries around the world use WHO guidelines to inform their own national guidelines. And this is a quote from the WHO guidelines on producing guidelines. The WHO guidelines on producing guidelines say WHO guidelines must be based on high quality systematic reviews, language in red. So they're institutionalizing use of evidence from high quality reviews. There's an example of checklist. This is from NICE, where that's the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, so National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, which is a health thing, here in the UK, which does guidelines based on systematic reviews. There's an example of some guidelines for how you allow a care home for people with dementia. That's from National Health Scotland. So it's very specific on you should do this, you should do that, in order to make people with dementia feel more comfortable. So all of this has been the evidence, what I call the evidence revolution. I would like everyone on this call to think we want to join the evidence revolution. So last slide is you have to think about where do you fit in. You can be working on the demand side and do things to increase demand for evidence, or you can be someone on the supply side who's either producing or using any element of what I call the evidence revolution in the evidence architecture. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. White. Sorry to speed you up, but we would love to have our next panelist join. Our next panelist is Katy Sutcliffe. She is an associate professor at the Evidence for Policy and Practice Information and Coordinating Center, or the EPI Center, Institute of Education at University College London. She is the Deputy Director of the Department of Health and Social Care Reviews Facility, which produces research syntheses to support the department's policy decisions. Dr. Sutcliffe specializes in developing systematic review methods for producing policy-relevant evidence. In particular, qualitative and mixed methods evidence syntheses and approaches for identifying the key ingredients and underlying mechanisms of interventions. Her presentation is titled Systematic Reviews for a Complex World, New Avenues in Evidence Synthesis. Katy, are you ready to begin?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much. And
Thank you.
everybody who's attending this evening. So in this session, I'm going to kind of follow on from what Howard's been talking about. And I'm going to be thinking about how systematic review methods are being extended and adapted to ensure that they're as useful as possible, taking us up that evidence pyramid, and making them useful as possible for people who are looking to translate or implement those findings in practice. So systematic reviews are, as Howard was saying, a widely recognised tool for understanding intervention effectiveness, appropriateness, and feasibility. And the robustness of the method and the comprehensiveness of the method ensures that the evidence is reliable. But of course, effective policy and practice decision-making requires nothing less. But the reliability, despite the reliability, researchers are beginning to question whether systematic reviews could be more useful and usable. Can you move forward the next? Yeah. So this quote is an extract from an interview by an Epicenter colleague with local policymakers about how they use evidence and systematic reviews. And here you can see in the quote, they recognise that some systematic reviews are perhaps too general or too broad, and others are so specific that there is little that is transferable. So they give the example of a systematic review on dance among women over the age of 75, saying it's quite interesting and potentially it's quite useful, but it's not that helpful in helping us to think about how we spend, as a service commissioner, our limited physical activity budget across a number of different options, which might be competing for similar resources. So there's a question here about the utility of systematic reviews. And a second quote in the blue box at the bottom comes from an excellent paper by John Enidis, which explores the growth of published systematic reviews and meta-analyses and examines how often they're redundant or misleading or serving conflicted interests. But one of the conclusions is that many reviews that are published are maybe misleading and few are useful. So this presentation focuses on how we can continue to develop systematic review methods to ensure that we produce reviews that are both robust and useful for their intended audiences. So why might a systematic review have limited usefulness? At the Epicenter, we have decades of experience of working with policymakers in both national and local government. And this engagement with policymakers has led us to recognise that sometimes the standard PICO or narrow questions asked in many reviews are not the kinds of questions that policymakers are asking. As in the previous slide, we had the example of a policymaker talking. So rather than asking for a single answer to a single question, for example, is intervention X effective for outcome Y, policymakers come to us and they ask, so what exactly is the extent of the problem and the nature of the problem, i.e. it falls in older women a particularly pressing issue in my area? Or they might ask, which of the range of possible interventions should we invest in? So even if I know that dance for older women is effective, is it more effective than other interventions and indeed more cost effective? They also might ask, will particular interventions be suitable? Will they work in my context or my country if we're drawing on international evidence? And they also often ask, well, so how exactly should we implement and deliver those interventions? And in addition to these more complex questions that policymakers often ask us, recently systematic reviews have also begun to grapple with the idea of intervention complexity. So many interventions can be considered complex in that they involve multiple interacting components. And in particular, social interventions, such as many educational interventions, public health interventions, including dance interventions, involve interactions between human beings, and so they're particularly complex as they're affected by the nature and beliefs of both the recipient and the provider. So for example, I take a dance class, a Zumba dance class every Saturday morning, and occasionally my teacher asks a friend to stand in for her, as she did when she got married a few weeks ago. And the stand-in teacher does exactly the same dances, exactly the same routines, but it's a completely different vibe in the class. It's much tougher, and many in my class won't come when they know that the stand-in teacher will be there. So there's an added layer of complexity of having human beings engage in interventions. So without examining and reporting the variation within interventions and intervention contexts examined in the systematic review, the features that make them tick are left unknown, and so decision makers are left unsure exactly what to implement and how. So systematic reviewers are recognising the need to grapple with these complexities. And this quote is from a really interesting set of papers on handling complexity in systematic reviews that you might be interested in. But here you can see the saying, so when the methods for conducting systematic reviews were originally developed, the process of reviewing the literature was treated as relatively straightforward. Complexity existed, but reviewers often try to simplify this complexity to group studies in attempts to make comparative claims. In general, systematic reviews and primary research included in systematic reviews approach research from a classic reductive philosophic and methodologic stance. And increasingly, people interested in adopting published interventions from reviews have found that this reductive stance eliminates details that are critical for them to understand whether the intervention is feasible and likely to work in their context with their populations and at what cost. So solutions to these issues are constantly evolving, and I'm going to take you through some potential solutions for enhancing the usefulness of systematic reviews. First, I'll talk you through some guidance for describing and reporting on the features of complex interventions evaluated in systematic reviews. And then secondly, I'll take you through two more analytic methods, which are trying to identify which aspects of complex interventions are vital to the success of that intervention. And those two analytic approaches are intervention component analysis and qualitative comparative analysis. So this first example is a guidance on describing complex interventions in systematic reviews. So this is a paper by a group of incredible systematic reviewers, an international group that I was fortunate to work with. And in the paper, we make the point that providing detailed information about interventions is vital for minimising research waste. And while this issue about research waste is being addressed to some degree in primary research, we also need to tackle it in systematic reviews. So the paper concludes that clinicians, patients, and policymakers cannot implement interventions identified as effective in systematic reviews if the details of the interventions are not known. Reviewers should be able to compare the details of interventions and consider whether, and if so, how to implement interventions in their setting. So in the guidance, we suggest that reviewers consider the details of interventions at all stages in a systematic review, in the planning, the conduct, and the reporting. So from the point of developing a protocol, to consider potential dimensions of variation between interventions that might impact on outcome. During data extraction, you can either develop or draw on existing tools, such as the Tidier checklist, to ensure you capture these important dimensions of difference in interventions. And where intervention is missing, you may wish to contact authors. And then the key point is to use these findings about the intervention details to help you interpret your findings. And key to all of it is that in a report of a systematic review, provide a detailed account of intervention characteristics and variation, as this is the vital information that decision makers require. So this table is very small, and you can look in the paper to see more detail there, but it's an exemplar of the level of detail that can be reported in a systematic review on intervention features. For example, this table captures the intervention theory, the why it's supposed to work, the materials required and the procedures, so the what, the type of provider and the mode of provision, the location and the timing, etc., etc. There's huge amounts of information in this table that service commissioners and providers, people looking to implement, it's the kind of information that they need. And the idea is that if all of these interventions are relatively similar in terms of their effectiveness, a commissioner or a practitioner could say, well, this particular version of the intervention looks like something we could implement here. It might work well in our situation. It looks feasible in our context. But similarly, it might help reviewers or users of review to detect sort of consistent associations between particular features of an intervention and outcomes. We might see a particular feature being consistently reported in the more effective interventions in systematic review. Which leads me on to the next examples I'm going to share with you. So intervention component analysis is the first example of an analytical method, attempting to look at these associations. So it moves beyond providing detailed intervention descriptions, and it seeks to identify the critical features of complex interventions. So the intervention component analysis approach differs from the guidance and framework in the previous paper, as it doesn't suggest using a standard or a priori framework to capture intervention details. ICA draws on methods from qualitative research, drawing on people's views and experiences and using an inductive or bottom-up approach to categorizing intervention features. There are three key stages. The first is to describe intervention features. And as I was saying, an inductive approach is used to categorize intervention features using information provided in the paper itself. And when having used this approach, it helped us to overcome inconsistencies in the language used and to develop a typology to capture important differences between interventions. The second stage involves looking within the paper, in the discussion section primarily, to gather the trialists or authors' insights on the strengths and weaknesses of different features of an intervention. So here we're using what we described as informal evidence, i.e. authors' reflections and accounts of ad hoc feedback from those involved in the trial. So it's not strictly speaking research evidence, but it offers some hugely valuable insights from people who are on the ground implementing that intervention. And the final stage, the third stage, again uses this type of informal evidence, but not to look at intervention features, but to consider and focus in on implementation of the intervention. For example, the training or the needs or the context in which it's delivered. Intervention component analysis was developed in response to a direct request from policymakers during a specific review for the Department of Health and Social Care in England. So we'd completed a review looking at the effectiveness of a range of interventions to reduce medication errors among children. And by medication errors, I mean where a healthcare practitioner prescribes or administers the wrong type of medicine or the wrong dose of a medicine, ultimately causing harm. And among the range of interventions that we examined, we found that electronic prescribing interventions, i.e. moving from a paper-based system to an electronic version of prescriptions, looked promising. But some of the studies that we identified showed increased harms, and in one study increased mortality among children following the implementation of the electronic system. So the review commissioners naturally asked, so if we're going to recommend this or it's going to be implemented in hospitals, what does a successful paediatric electronic prescribing system look like? What are its key features? How should hospitals go about implementing electronic prescribing, and how can we avoid the harms that were evident in some studies? So in stage one, the inductive approach enabled us to develop this bespoke taxonomy of interventions. We found that interventions differed along four key dimensions. The first was the type of system. Some hospitals bought in commercially available systems, or what we called off-the-peg systems. Other hospitals modified a commercially available system for use with child patients, and other hospitals developed their own homegrown systems from scratch. The second dimension was to do whether the systems implemented were generic systems designed for use with adults, or whether they were tailored specifically for use with children. The third dimension, whether or not they included what we called front-end decision support. So the front-end decision support is where features that are intentionally accessed by clinicians involving support tools. For example, a dose calculator. So you would call up the dose calculator and you put in the age and weight of a child, and the system would calculate an appropriate dose, thereby avoiding simple mathematic errors. Others included back-end features, And these back-end features tended to be more safety features to prevent errors. So for example, the system wouldn't allow a prescription to be processed unless all the relevant fields, age, weight, etc., had been completed. In the rows are the studies included in this review. The studies are grouped according to the type of package, with the 4 studies, Hahn, Johnny, King, Walsh, using off-the-peg tools at the top. Then we have, if you move to the next, we have the customized ones below that. And then if we move to the next, homegrown packages. And finally, we had 2 package types where it was unclear which type of system was being used. And the different columns, if we move to the next, indicate the different features of intervention. So for example, this first column indicates whether each study used a pediatric specific system or not. And where a cell is shaded in grey, this indicates that a feature is present. So for example, the Hahn study in the first row was not a pediatric specific system, and its only features were 2 back-end features, so alerts and mandatory fields. They had no front-end features described as part of their system. And you can see that generally the off-the-peg tools at the top of the table had fewer front-end decision support features. The 3 studies marked in red in the first column are those which resulted in harmful outcomes. In one study, as I said, that was an increase in mortality. The bottom study by Sowen is actually qualitatively different for reasons that I don't have time to go into now, but essentially the 2 key studies, so if we move to the final stage of the animation, at the top, marked in red, Hahn and King, you can see that they're involve minimal or no front-end decision support and appear to be quite different from most of the other studies included in the review. So having looked at the features of those interventions, we then move to looking at this informal evidence, so the authors' views and commentary on the strengths and weaknesses of those different features. And we can see that 15 out of the 20 authors commented that front-end decision support tools were particularly valuable, so those that were missing in those 2 harmful studies, with one author concluding that positive results might not be achievable with only nominal decision support. Fewer studies commented on the back-end type of features, and additionally, we had some authors helpfully commenting on potential pitfalls with front-end decision support. So this is the kind of information that might be really useful when designing or customizing EP in a particular hospital. So in stage 3, we consider these issues around development and implementation, again drawing on informal evidence, and we found 5 key themes emerged. One consistent theme was in support of customization. Almost 3/4 of authors commented on the importance of customizing electronic prescribing systems for children, or warned against using off-the-peg adult tools with children. Other key themes were to engage with a range of stakeholders during development, foster familiarity with the system before going live with it, and ensure infrastructure is adequate and appropriate. So having looked at the 3 stages of ICA, it's clear that the methods involve some balance or trade-off between rigor and insight. Using informal evidence is not equivalent to using rigorously collected research data, but notwithstanding these limitations, it was undoubtedly a really useful source of critical insight into the strengths and limitations of the interventions. And moreover, this kind of informal evidence is, an evidence source that's currently underutilised. So we did make some efforts to mitigate these weaknesses. So we looked at other relevant research which helped to verify the implementation themes. But we also, as you would have seen as sort of going through, we were really explicit about the extent of this informal data and the consistency of opinion across the studies. So the final example is qualitative comparative analysis, and it's another analytic strategy to identify critical intervention components. Time is short, but I have previously given another webinar on this if people are interested. Briefly, QCA aims to answer a very similar question to ICA, essentially getting at the key features or mechanisms of most successful interventions rather than what works on average. But QCA is more systematic in its analytical approach and unlike ICA, it quantifies the level of association between intervention components and successful outcomes. I'll skip through this, I'm afraid, since we're short of time and people can understand some more about QCA using the previous webinar. Systematic reviews are unquestionably the most robust and rigorous method for assembling evidence to support policy and practice. But we need to continue to evolve ways to ensure that our systematic reviews are also useful and usable if they're to avoid being left gathering dust on the shelf. And on the very final slide, I have some additional readings that people might be interested in.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sutcliffe. Now I'll turn things over to Francesca Gimigliano, who will give our final presentation today. Dr. Gimigliano is an associate professor of physical and rehabilitation medicine, president of the School of Speech and Language Therapy, and delegate for the Chancellor for the Communication and Third Missions at the University of Campania, Luigi Vanvitelli in Italy. She is the Vice President of the International Society of Physical and Rehabilitation Medicine, and she's also the Chair of the Cochrane Rehabilitation Communication Committee and one of the editors of the Cochrane Rehabilitation eBook. She'll present on this eBook project and discuss how to deliver key messages to different audiences. Dr. Gimigliano, are you ready to begin?
Yes, thank you, Anne. And good pronunciation of my last name. Thank you.
Thank you.
Not an easy one. So this is the very simple outline of my presentation. I will give you a brief introduction to Cochrane and Cochrane Rehabilitation, and then I will spend a few more minutes to speak about the Cochrane Rehabilitation ebook, which is probably one of the most important Katy activities that we are running within Cochrane Rehabilitation. As you might be already familiar with, Cochrane is this great global independent network, including thousands of members among researchers, professionals, patients, and carers, and people interested in health, who has the mission to promote evidence-informed health decision-making by producing high-quality, relevant, accessible, systematic reviews and other synthesized research evidence. Cochrane is organized in review group networks, which are responsible for the preparation and maintenance of systematic reviews, geographic groups, which are instead responsible to support Cochrane contributors in their area and act as a point of contact between Cochrane and the regional health communities. The methods group, which have the scope of developing and implementing the methods used in the preparation of Cochrane reviews, and the Cochrane fields, which are focused on a dimension of healthcare, a condition or a topic, and represent the interests of this dimension. Both geographic groups and fields have as their main mission the knowledge translation. In Cochrane Rehabilitation, the dimension of healthcare is, of course, physical and rehabilitation medicine. And our main aim is to function as a bridge between rehabilitation stakeholders and Cochrane groups. We have both two aims, that is on a side to facilitate the work of Cochrane Review Group, and on the other to ensure that Cochrane reviews are both relevant and accessible to our community, so both fellow specialists and consumers. The Cochrane strategy to 2020 is very much focused on knowledge translation as well. In fact, Cochrane priorities are now not only to facilitate the production of Cochrane systematic review, but above all to make sure that as many people as possible worldwide can access them and use this evidence in their decision making. In its Katy strategy, Cochrane has identified 4 different key audiences that would be consumers and the public, practitioners, policymakers and health managers, and researchers and research funders. We have identified 4 similar audiences for our ebook, with the only difference that we assimilated the researchers to the practitioners and the research funders to the politician side. And we added the students as a specific target audience. Let's come into the details of the Cochrane Rehabilitation ebook. The ebook is meant to be a live book available for free in the internet that would be constantly be updated and will include all Cochrane systematic reviews relevant to rehabilitation. Here you can see the full list of the editors of the ebook. The ebook is financed and co-authored by the European Physical and Rehabilitation Medicine Bodies Alliance, which includes the European Union of Medical Specialists in Physical and Rehabilitation Medicine, both the section and board, the European Society of Physical and Rehabilitation Medicine, and the European Academy of Rehabilitation Medicine. And it is produced in collaboration with the residency programs in Physical and Rehabilitation Medicine at the University of Campania Luigi Vanvitelli, which is the residency program that I'm chairing, and the Polytechnic University of Marche in Ancona, which is another charming city in Italy. The ebook production can be summarized in 9 steps. The first step, which we might consider as completed, is to identify all the Cochrane systematic reviews relevant to rehabilitation by the Cochrane Rehabilitation Review Group. The Cochrane Rehabilitation Review Group had already made the huge effort to tag all the Cochrane systematic reviews relevant to rehabilitation up to this moment, but of course this is a continuous process. And in this publication, which is quite recent, there is the result of this effort made till the mid of 2018. And it resulted that 1 in 11 Cochrane reviews are of rehabilitation interest because they're actually using rehabilitation interventions. This is for sure an impressive data showing how many Cochrane reviews are directly relevant to rehabilitation. And it suggests that rehabilitation community needs to be considered as a major stakeholder in all Cochrane work. The following steps were instead meant to the creation of an ebook index. As any book, our live book would have an index, and we initially drafted the index after consulting the table of contents of the most referenced and updated rehabilitation books. We then decided to inquire all rehabilitation professionals in 4 Delphi rounds, including physical therapists, nurses, occupational therapists, psychologists, speech therapists, neuropsychologists, orthotists, and prosthetists, apart than physiatrists, in order to make sure that our index would be globally validated. And this is the first time that a book index is actually validated with such process. We are currently working on matching all the Cochrane systematic reviews that had been previously tagged with the content of the final draft of the index. And doing this, we have realized that there are that not all the topics were actually uniformly covered by the Cochrane review groups. And we have decided to run a prioritization exercise to put in evidence both existing gaps in Cochrane systematic reviews production and any redundancies. The following flowchart describes the process that leads to the production of the book context. The resident students of the Vanvitelli University and the Polytechnic University of Marche, with 2 local coordinators, are guided to prepare the summaries of the Cochrane systematic reviews. And for each Cochrane systematic review, they have to prepare 4 different summaries for the 4 different identified target audiences. And each summary will be reviewed for the first time inside Cochrane community, the Cochrane rehabilitation community. And in a second step, these summaries will be reviewed by European Bodies Alliance. At the end, I will revise all the summary, edit them, and the summaries would undergo the approval of the European Bodies Alliance as well. In this slide, you will see how the ebook website will look like. For each Cochrane systematic review, you will have the reference to the full review, the abstract, and the plain language summary. And then you will have the for audience targeted summaries. The summary for clinician targets all clinician and allied rehabilitational professionals. It will have to, these summaries will have to be approved by the delegates of the European Society of Physical and Rehabilitation Medicine that represents our clinicians. And as a general guidance, we ask the residents in PRM to write in the first paragraph what we know and what we don't know about investigative intervention. In a second paragraph, the aim of the Cochrane systematic review. Then which were the main outcomes, what was the intervention included, which were the control groups. Another paragraph giving information about the number of trials and the total number of participants included. A brief but accurate description of the main results, considering the summary of findings table and the grade whenever this is possible. And the final paragraph with the conclusions based on the main results of the systematic review and considering the paragraph of the implications for practice, and also using the probably main scheme of the plain language summary guidance developed by Cochrane Norway. The summary for students instead target, of course, all medical or allied rehabilitational professional students. These summaries will have to be approved by the UMS PRM board delegates, which is the body inside European Alliance responsible for education. And as a reference guide, we asked the resident students to prepare the summaries, including at first a brief description of the disease, then a description of the investigated intervention, the aim of the review, and a summary of the results as described in the Cochrane systematic review plain language summary, and finally a comment on how and if the evidence could change in the future. We consider that students might be very interested in how research might change our current estimate of findings, because they might be interested in making this research by themselves. As for the summary for the health managers and policymakers, we asked for the approval of the UMS PRM section delegates who represent our policymaker inside physical and rehabilitation medicine. And these summaries are designed to be brief and straightforward. We asked the residents to write a description of the epidemiology of the disease and the cost of the disease and its treatment, to describe the standard treatment and how the investigated treatment is part of the standard treatment or alternative to it, including, wherever possible, the international national guidelines. We asked them to give very brief summary of the main results as described in the plain language summary, and to write a conclusion about rehabilitation. Finally, our summary for consumers would target rehabilitation patients and caregivers. And the only recommendation that we gave was to write the summaries in a clear and simple language as when they explain to a patient its pathology, functioning, and possible treatments, and to be focused on rehabilitation patients. The following steps would be to translate the ebook in different languages, to make sure to publish it not only on the website, but also on journals of rehabilitation interests, and to continuously update the ebook. The ebook represents an important answer to Cochrane Katy's strategy, as it targets all Cochrane audiences with specific summaries and translations. And at the same time, it is a systematic collection of all Katy products. It would be a tool which would help to determine the priorities for review production, might help creating stable and relevant relationship with the stakeholders involved in the co-production, and be a hard and relevant, understandable and visible Katy product that might lead informed decisions. If you're interested in having more information about the Cochrane Rehabilitation ebook, you can read this paper published on the European Journal of Physical and Rehabilitation Medicine. The ebook will be officially launched in May 2020 during the next Congress of the European Society of Physical and Rehabilitation Medicine. Last but not least, if you wish to know more about Cochrane Rehabilitation or would like to collaborate with us, you can visit our website and email Cochrane Rehabilitation Headquarters or myself. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gimigliano. At this time, I'd like to invite our reactors and all the panelists to turn on their webcams. Thank you. I see you all. All right, so first I'd like to give Dr. Gimigliano a chance to answer some questions that came up in the chat. So first, is the ebook that you mentioned, is it going to be open access?
It will.
Great.
It will be open access.
Great. And then Margaret asks, will medical rehabilitation issues specifically or disproportionately experienced by women be addressed in the ebook?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have understood the question well, but if the question is if women issues, rehabilitation issues will be addressed, the answer is yes.
Great. And a follow-up to that, she's concerned that the sources that you're using to generate content may not have sufficient knowledge about the information gaps. So in other words,
oh, sorry, and for interrupting you. The only source that we are using are the Cochrane systematic reviews of rehabilitation interest.
Great. So that totally makes sense. Thank you. A question earlier that arose for you, Dr. White, is could you describe what the difference is between strength of evidence rating and confidence?
Yeah, okay, so that would be the same. I thought the question was about I forget the word now used in the Sightsavers. So basically in Sightsavers you've got two dimensions. One is what the evidence says. So is it strongly supporting the intervention? Is it weakly supporting the intervention? Is a small effect on the intervention? Or inconclusive for showing mixed effects from different studies across different outcomes? And then the confidence in the evidence relates to the quality of the studies. So we could have low confidence in study findings or high confidence or medium confidence study findings, depending on the way in which the study was conducted and reported. And they're standardized instruments for appraising study. We shouldn't say quality, because it's used as shorthand, because there might be reasons why you have low confidence study findings like differential attrition, which are not really a reflection of low quality. I did a map on homelessness interventions, and homelessness interventions suffer a lot of differential attrition. So much higher attrition in the control group than the treatment group. And there's no fault really of the researchers. They can't do anything much about that given their study design and budgets. But it does give us much less confidence study findings. So confidence study findings is, do we really trust these findings? So we saw that for QCC, there was a lot of independent reviews saying, oh, it's effective, strong evidence in favour, but they were low confidence study findings.
Excellent. Ashley, let us know if that answers your question. I think it was very clear, Dr. Howard. one more question came in from Renee for you, Dr. Gimigliano. How often will you update this ebook, and how will you differentiate between the older and the newer versions?
We will constantly do it, because as soon as the new Cochrane systematic review that are published are tagged as rehabilitation, we will assign them to some residents for making the summaries. And we have not thought about having a DOI at the moment, because we will have a website where all this information will be. And then when we will have a hard copy of the book, we'll probably ask also for a DOI.
Thank you. And going back to that question before, since systematic reviews only include the limited number of studies that meet the inclusion criteria for research design, are there ways that you can think that their findings should be triangulated with other sources of knowledge?
Yes, but it's not in the scope of our ebook, actually.
Definitely. Thank you for that clarification, Francesca. Now I'd like to turn things over to Janet. Are you there, Janet? What strategies have you found to be effective in delivering a message to consumers and the public in the work that you're doing? It looks like she's having some trouble with her audio. So Kate, may I pass this on to you while we work on Janet's audio?
Sure. My strategy to be effective in delivering messages, well, Howard, you really struck a chord with me today when you mentioned that some of these documents that get released at the end are over 200 pages, and to go through all of that content is a bit overwhelming for some audiences, such as decision makers or patients and caregivers and their families. So my advice or my expertise here would be to say, choose your audience and choose the messages that need to go along with that audience. So if you're talking to caregivers of a specific group, or maybe even their patients, drilling down what is the most important information from that review or from that bulk of information that you found, and starting there. It might not be the end of it, but it's certainly a good start.
Thank you so much. I think they're working on Janet's audio. We have just a few minutes left. Janet, are you able to talk with us? Okay. That's unfortunate. You've offered such great perspectives throughout the day, but you can go ahead and chat in any of your responses, or just talk as we're going. It looks like those are the questions that have come in from the chat box. If you have any final questions, I invite you all to type them into the chat box, and if not, we can close up. All right. Well, I wanted to thank all of you for joining us. Thank you to our panelists, to our esteemed reactors. We really appreciate you spending your day with us, and for providing your insights. So thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you on Friday.